The sound came from the corner table. Not loud, just a strange pause in the noise of the restaurant. Daniel noticed it because he had been watching his daughter struggle with a fork. She was 6, concentrated, tongue pressed against her lip. The kind of moment that made the whole room fade for him. Then the pause stretched. A woman at the nearby table stood halfway from her chair. Her hand went to her throat. Not dramatic, just confused, like her body had stopped following instructions. The people with her didn't react right away. One of them kept talking. Daniel watched her eyes change first. That was the moment he knew. Some people freeze when something goes wrong. Daniel never had that option. He stood before anyone else understood what was happening. The restaurant wasn't crowded, but it wasn't quiet either. Plates touched wood, chairs shifted, low conversations blended together until the room carried a steady murmur that never really stopped. Nothing about the evening felt unusual. Daniel had chosen the place because it was simple. No music too loud. No long wait for food. The waitress had smiled at his daughter the moment they walked in and brought a small cup of crayons without asking. Those things mattered to him more than the menu. Across the table, Lily leaned forward, staring down at the plate like it had given her a problem to solve. A piece of chicken sat in front of her. She had cut it badly. The fork kept sliding off. Daniel watched without interrupting. She wanted to do things herself lately. Small victories meant more to her than help. Almost, she murmured to herself. He hid a small smile and took a sip of water. It had been a long day. Not the kind people noticed, but the kind that pressed quietly on the back of the neck until evening finally arrived. Work had ended late. Traffic had been slow. Lily had fallen asleep in the car for 10 minutes, then woken up confused and hungry. Life had been like that for a while now. Small adjustments, quiet endurance. Daniel wasn't thinking about any of that when the sound happened. It wasn't dramatic, just absence. A pause where something normal should have continued. He looked up because of the silence in the wrong place. 2 tables away, a woman stood halfway out of her chair. Her posture looked wrong. Not panicked, not loud, just stuck. One hand touched her throat. Daniel's eyes moved to her face. People imagine choking looks violent. Sudden, obvious. It rarely does. Her mouth opened once. Then again, no sound came out. The man beside her was speaking, his hand moving through the air as if he were finishing a point. He hadn't looked up yet. Another woman at the table frowned slightly, waiting for the first woman to sit back down. Daniel watched the moment stretch. Then he saw her eyes. They weren't wide. They were confused. That was the sign. Daniel's chair scraped the floor before he realized he had moved. Lily looked up quickly. "Daddy?" He touched her shoulder gently as he passed. "Stay here." His voice stayed calm. It always did when something went wrong. The distance to the other table was only a few steps, but it felt longer because people still didn't understand what was happening. The choking woman had now bent slightly forward. Both hands were near her throat. The man next to her had stopped talking. "What's wrong?" he asked. She couldn't answer. Her lips moved. No air passed. Daniel reached the table. "Step back," he said quietly. The words weren't loud, but they carried weight. The man blinked, confused. "What?" "She's choking." That changed the air immediately. The second woman stood abruptly, her chair hitting the floor behind her. "Oh my God!" Daniel had already moved behind the choking woman. Up close, he could see the strain building in her face. The body reacts quickly when oxygen disappears. Panic arrives whether the mind wants it or not. Her shoulders trembled slightly. He placed one hand gently on her back. "It's okay," he said, steady and low. "I've got you." She couldn't respond, but she heard him. People always did in moments like that. He positioned his arms around her waist. Somewhere behind him, someone shouted for help. Another voice called for a manager. A phone lifted into the air. Daniel ignored all of it. Focus narrowed to the body in front of him. One fist just above her navel. The other hand wrapped over it. He paused for the smallest fraction of a second. Timing mattered. Then he pulled sharply inward and upward. The movement was controlled but firm. The woman's body jerked slightly. Nothing came out. A second passed. Her breathing still didn't return. Daniel adjusted his stance. Second thrust. Harder. Her chest tightened against his arms. Then, a sharp cough broke through the room. A piece of food landed on the table. The sound of air rushing back into lungs followed. It's a sound Daniel never forgot once he had heard it the first time years ago. Relief, raw, and immediate. The woman bent forward, coughing again. Her body shook with the force of it. Daniel loosened his grip, but stayed close. "Slow breaths," he said quietly. The people around the table stared at him like they had only just noticed he existed. The man beside her looked stunned. "Jesus, He stopped speaking." The woman took another breath, then another, each one steadier than the last. Her face had changed color slightly, but the panic had begun to fade. Daniel stepped back one pace. That was when the room finally reacted. Voices rushed in all at once. "Is she okay? Someone call. Water, get water." Chairs scraped loudly, but Daniel's attention had already shifted. Across the room, Lily was still sitting where he left her. She watched him with wide, serious eyes. He gave her a small nod. "Everything's fine." Children understood that signal better than words. Behind him, the woman he had helped slowly straightened. Her breathing steadied. For a moment she didn't speak. Then she turned. Her eyes met Daniel's. Up close now, he noticed details he hadn't seen before. She was older than he first thought. Not old, but carrying the kind of composure that came from years of responsibility. Her clothes were elegant without being loud. The people at her table had the same quiet confidence of people used to authority. But none of that mattered right now. Right now, she just looked like someone who had almost disappeared from the room. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was rough from coughing. Daniel nodded once. "You're okay." It wasn't a question. She inhaled carefully again. "Yes." Their eyes held for 1 second longer. Then Daniel stepped away. He didn't wait for applause. He didn't wait for questions. He simply walked back to his table. Lily was still watching him. "Is the lady okay?" she asked softly. Daniel picked up his chair and sat down again. "Yes." She studied his face carefully. "You fixed it." Daniel shook his head slightly. "She just needed help." Lily looked back toward the other table. People had gathered around the woman now. Water glasses, concerned voices, phones still half raised. The woman herself was still looking across the room at Daniel, but he had already picked up his fork. "Finish your chicken," he said gently, and for him, the moment was already over. Lily tried the chicken again. The first bite finally stayed on the fork. She lifted it carefully, watching it like it might escape. When she succeeded, she looked proud for only a second before pretending it had never been difficult. Daniel noticed. He always did. Across the room the air had changed. Conversations had stopped, then returned slowly, but softer now. People had seen something sudden. They were still adjusting to it. The woman Daniel had helped was sitting again. Someone handed her water. She took a careful sip, then another. Her hands were steady now, though she still held the glass with both of them. Daniel didn't stare. He had already seen what mattered. Lily leaned forward slightly. Was she dying? The question came out quietly. Not scared, just honest. Daniel thought for a moment before answering. She couldn't breathe. That's bad. Yes. Lily chewed another bite while thinking about it. Children process things in pieces, but you helped her. Daniel nodded once. That's what people do. Lily seemed satisfied with that explanation. She returned her attention to the food. The waitress approached their table slowly, glancing past Daniel toward the other side of the room. Her voice came out in a whisper even though it didn't need to. "Sir, that was, She stopped, unsure how to finish the sentence. Daniel looked up. "She's breathing again. That's what matters." The waitress nodded quickly, still a little shaken. "Your dinner is on the house tonight." Daniel shook his head. "That's not necessary." "It's already done," she said. He didn't argue further. Sometimes people needed a way to close a moment. The restaurant gradually returned to its rhythm. Forks moved again. Glasses lifted. Conversations restarted. But every now and then, someone looked toward Daniel's table. He ignored it. He had learned a long time ago that attention made things heavier than they needed to be. Across the room, the woman finally stood again. The people at her table hovered around her, asking quiet questions. She answered them calmly now. Then she did something that made Daniel pause for the first time since the moment ended. She began walking toward him. Not quickly, not dramatically, just directly. Daniel saw her reflection in the window before he looked up. Lily noticed too. "The lady is coming," she whispered. Daniel set his fork down. The woman stopped beside their table. Up close, her composure had mostly returned, but the memory of what had happened was still present in her breathing. People who had nearly lost air carried that feeling for a while. "Excuse me," she said. Daniel looked up. "Yes?" For a second she didn't speak. She seemed to be studying him, trying to understand something she hadn't expected. "I don't think I said that properly before," she said. "Thank you." Her voice was steady now. Daniel nodded again. "You're welcome." Silence followed for a moment. Then she noticed Lily. The child was staring up at her without shyness. "This is my daughter," Daniel said quietly. "Hi," Lily said. The woman smiled gently. "Hi." Her eyes softened for the first time since she walked over. "You have a brave father." Lily shrugged like it was obvious. "He fixes stuff." Daniel felt a small pressure in his chest that had nothing to do with the restaurant. The woman noticed the worn backpack hanging from the chair beside Lily. Crayons were sticking out of the top pocket. For a moment the scene looked very ordinary, which made the earlier moment feel even stranger. "I would like to repay you somehow," the woman said. Daniel shook his head immediately. "That's not necessary." "It is to me. I'm glad you're okay. That's enough." Her eyes stayed on him a little longer. She wasn't used to people refusing things. That much was clear without words. At the table behind her, someone called her name softly. "Victoria." Daniel hadn't known it before that moment. Victoria turned slightly. "I'll be there in a moment." She looked back at Daniel. "If you change your mind." He shook his head gently again. "I won't." Something about the way he said it made her pause. Not defensive, not proud, just certain. She studied him for another second, then nodded slowly. "Then I'll remember you," she said. Daniel didn't answer that. He picked up his fork again. Victoria returned to her table. The people there immediately leaned toward her, whispering again. Someone handed her another glass of water. Daniel didn't look back. Lily finished her plate. When they were done, Daniel hiked her into her jacket. The crayons went back into the backpack. The check never arrived, just like the waitress had promised. As they walked toward the door, the restaurant felt different again. Quieter. A few people watched them leave. Lily held his hand tightly. Outside, the night air felt cool and steady. Cars moved slowly along the street. The city carried on like nothing unusual had happened. Daniel opened the passenger door of the car. Lily climbed in. Before he closed the door, she looked up at him. "Daddy?" "Yes." "You saved her." Daniel rested one arm on the roof of the car. For a moment he didn't answer. Then he said softly, "She was just in trouble." Lily seemed to accept that. He closed the door gently. Across the street, the restaurant windows glowed with warm light. Inside, Victoria was still sitting at her table. And even from that distance, Daniel could see that she was looking toward the door he had just walked through. He didn't stay long enough to see more. The engine started. The car pulled away. For Daniel, the night returned to its normal shape. Dinner. A tired child. Work in the morning. For Victoria, though, the room didn't feel the same anymore, because a moment earlier, everything in her life had nearly stopped, and the man who had pulled her back into it had simply walked away without waiting to be remembered. The restaurant emptied slowly after Daniel left. Victoria stayed longer than the others expected. Her water glass had been refilled twice. She hadn't touched the second one. Breathing had returned to normal, But something deeper still felt unsettled, like her body had remembered something her mind wasn't ready to examine. Across the table, Martin watched her carefully. "You should go home," he said. She nodded without looking at him. "I will." But she didn't move. Her eyes drifted toward the door again, the same door Daniel and his daughter had walked through only minutes earlier. By now the street outside looked ordinary again. Cars passed. People walked by without slowing down. Nothing about it suggested that someone inside the room had nearly stopped breathing. Victoria leaned back slightly in her chair. Her throat still felt raw. Every swallow reminded her of the moment when air had disappeared. It hadn't been loud. There had been no dramatic warning. Just a bite of food, a swallow, and then nothing. She had tried to breathe in. Her body refused. The memory returned in fragments. The strange pressure in her chest. The confusion when her lungs didn't respond. The way the room had continued moving around her while she stood there, unable to explain what was wrong. People were still talking. Someone had been laughing. She had tried to speak. Nothing came out. Her hand had moved to her throat almost automatically. Then there had been the growing realization that the silence inside her chest wasn't going away. Victoria had faced many kinds of pressure in her life. Boardrooms full of hostile investors. Negotiations that could shift the direction of entire companies. Moments where hundreds of jobs depended on a single decision. But none of those moments felt anything like that one. Because control had disappeared completely, the body doesn't negotiate when oxygen vanishes. It simply begins shutting things down. Victoria closed her eyes briefly. She remembered the exact second when fear arrived. Not panic. Fear, quiet and sharp. This might be how it ends. Then a voice had appeared behind her. Calm. Certain. Step back. The memory of that voice stayed clearer than anything else. She opened her eyes again. Martin was still watching her. "You scared the hell out of us," he said. "I know. You should get checked by a doctor." "It was food," she said. "It's gone now." "That's not the point." Victoria looked at him finally. His expression carried the kind of concern that rarely entered business conversations. "I'm fine," she repeated. He didn't argue again, but his shoulders stayed tense. Another woman at the table, Claire, leaned forward. "Who was he?" Victoria didn't answer right away. "The man who helped you," Claire continued. "Did you know him?" Victoria shook her head slowly. "No." "That's strange." "Yes." Claire glanced toward the door as if the man might still be standing there. "He didn't even stay." Victoria's gaze returned to the empty entrance. "No," she said quietly. "He didn't." Claire leaned back again. "That's unusual." Martin let out a short breath. "Unusual?" Martin let out a short breath. "Unusual. The guy saved your life and walked out like he forgot his umbrella." Victoria almost smiled. Not because the description was wrong. Because it was accurate. She replayed the moment again. The man had arrived quickly but without chaos. His hands had been steady. His voice calm. There had been no hesitation. And when it was over, he had simply returned to his table, as if he had just moved a chair out of someone's path. Claire was still thinking about it. "You should at least find out who he is." Victoria looked at her. "For what?" "To thank him properly." "I did thank him." Claire shook her head. That wasn't enough. Victoria didn't respond immediately. Her attention had shifted to something else. The image of the little girl sitting across from him. Small. Focused. Watching everything quietly. Victoria remembered the moment their eyes had met. Children often reacted strongly to emergencies, but the girl hadn't looked frightened. She had looked certain. Like this was something her father simply handled. That detail stayed with Victoria longer than she expected. She finished the last sip of water, then finally pushed her chair back. "Let's go." Outside, the air felt colder than when they arrived. Victoria paused on the sidewalk. The city stretched in every direction, filled with noise, movement, light. She had spent most of her life inside that motion, building companies, making decisions that moved millions of dollars in a single afternoon. People often described her as powerful. She understood why. Power usually meant control, but 20 minutes earlier she had stood inside a crowded room unable to breathe. No negotiation, no strategy, no influence, just a body shutting down, and a stranger who refused to let it happen. Martin opened the car door for her. "You sure you're all right?" Victoria nodded. "Yes." She got inside. The car pulled into traffic, but her mind stayed behind in the restaurant. More specifically, at the moment when the man had spoken to her after it was over. "You're okay." He hadn't asked. He had said it like a statement, like someone who already understood the outcome. Victoria looked out the window as the city lights passed. "Martin," she said. "Yes?" "Find him." Martin glanced at her briefly from the front seat. "The guy from the restaurant?" "Yes." "That could take time." Victoria didn't look away from the window. "That's fine." She paused, then added quietly, "I want to know who walks away from something like that." The next morning began the way most of Victoria's mornings did. Early, quiet, deliberate. Her apartment sat high above the city, surrounded by glass that caught the pale gray light before the sun had fully risen. From that height, the streets looked distant, almost abstract. Cars moved like small patterns instead of machines carrying people with problems and schedules. Victoria usually liked that distance. It made things easier to manage. Control worked best when the details stayed organized and far enough away to observe clearly. But that morning, control felt thinner than usual. She stood near the kitchen counter holding a cup of coffee she had forgotten to drink. Her throat still felt slightly sore. Every swallow reminded her. Air had stopped. Not long. Maybe 20 seconds. But the body doesn't measure those moments the way clocks do. The body measures them in instinct, in warning, in the sudden awareness that everything you have built sits on top of something fragile. Victoria rarely allowed herself to think about fragility. Her schedule left little space for it. At 8:30, she would meet the executive board. At 10, there was a call with investors in Singapore. By noon, she would approve the final draft of a merger contract that had taken 8 months to negotiate. Her assistant had already sent the day's agenda at 5:45 that morning. Every hour had a place, but the memory from the restaurant kept moving into those spaces. Not the choking itself. The man. More specifically, the way he had left. Victoria had spent years around people who reacted strongly to moments like that. Heroism usually came with volume. Excitement. Phones recording. People explaining what they had done. Recognition had its own gravity. But Daniel had stepped back from the woman he had just helped to breathe again and returned to his table like the evening had only paused for a moment. Then he left. No conversation. No exchange of names. Just a quiet exit through the front door. Victoria set the coffee down without drinking it. Her phone vibrated on the counter. A message from Martin, working on it. Restaurant checking cameras. She read the message once, then placed the phone back down. It was an urgency that made her ask him to find the man. It was something harder to explain, a feeling that the moment carried meaning she hadn't fully understood yet. Victoria walked to the window again. The sun had begun to break through the morning haze. The city looked sharper now. People were already moving across the sidewalks below. Thousands of lives unfolding at once. She wondered how many of them would react the way he had. No hesitation, no performance, just action, then departure. The phone buzzed again. Martin calling this time. Victoria answered. "Yes. We spoke with the restaurant manager," he said. "And they have security footage." Victoria waited. Victoria waited. The man arrived with a little girl, maybe 6 or 7. They were seated near the window. Victoria closed her eyes briefly. She remembered the girl clearly. Serious eyes, careful hands holding the fork. "Do they know who he is?" "Not yet." Martin hesitated slightly, but something else. "What?" "He paid cash." Victoria frowned slightly. "That matters. It means there's no transaction record, no card name." She thought about that. Of course, a man who leaves without waiting for thanks probably wasn't interested in being easy to trace either. Martin continued. "The manager said he's been there before, though." Victoria straightened slightly. "How often?" "Not sure, but the waitress recognized him." What did she say? Martin shuffled papers on his end of the call. She said he usually comes in with the same girl, orders simple food, stays about 40 minutes. Victoria pictured the scene again. A father and daughter sharing dinner at the end of a long day. No phones on the table, no rush, just time. Something about that detail pressed unexpectedly on her chest. Did she know his name? Victoria asked. No. Silence stretched across the call for a moment. Then Martin added, but she did say something else. What? He never stays long after eating. Always leaves quietly. Tips well. Victoria almost smiled again. Consistent. Predictable. Invisible. Martin's voice returned. We'll keep looking. Security footage might help identify the car. Victoria thought about the parking area outside the restaurant. Cars had come and gone quickly, but cameras saw more than people noticed. Let me know when you find something, she said. Of course. The call ended. Victoria remained standing by the window for several seconds after the screen went dark. The city had fully woken up now. Traffic moved steadily. Office lights flickered on in distant towers. Another normal day beginning. But the memory from the restaurant had already started shifting something inside her. Not dramatically. Not yet. More like a quiet question forming. Victoria had spent most of her life surrounded by people who moved toward power. Careers, money, influence, recognition. It was the direction ambition usually traveled. But the man from the restaurant had moved the opposite way. He had stepped into a moment where someone else needed help. Then stepped out before anyone could attach anything to him. Victoria picked up the coffee again and finally took a sip. It had gone cold. She didn't seem to notice. Because another memory had surfaced. The moment their eyes met after it was over, he hadn't looked proud. He hadn't looked relieved. He had simply checked that she could breathe again, then returned to his daughter. As if that had always been the most important thing in the room, Victoria set the cup down slowly. People often spoke about extraordinary actions, but what stayed with her wasn't the action itself. It was the absence of everything that usually followed. No explanation, no reward, no attention. Just a quiet man who fixed something broken for a stranger and went back to dinner with his child. Victoria looked down at the city again. Let's see who you are, she said softly. Not because she needed to repay a favor, but because something in that small moment had begun asking a much larger question, and she had the resources to follow it wherever it led. Daniel woke before the alarm. It happened most mornings. Years of responsibility had trained his body to rise early, even when sleep had been shallow. For a few seconds, he stayed still, listening. The apartment carried the quiet of early morning, pipes settling in the walls, a distant truck somewhere outside, the faint hum of a refrigerator in the kitchen, then a small sound from the other room. Fabric shifting. Daniel sat up. He checked the clock on the nightstand. 6002. Right on time. He stood and walked across the short hallway to Lily's room. The door was slightly open. Light from the window fell across the bed where Lily had already pushed her blanket halfway to the floor. She wasn't asleep anymore. She was sitting cross-legged near the pillows, holding a small plastic horse in one hand and whispering something to it. Daniel leaned against the doorframe. Morning. Lily looked up immediately. Morning. Her hair had turned into a small storm overnight. She pushed it away from her face. Are we late? No. Okay. She placed the horse carefully on the blanket. Daniel stepped inside. Did you sleep? A little. That's good. She nodded like she had accomplished something. Daniel pulled the blanket back over her legs. The apartment was small, but it worked. 2 rooms, a narrow kitchen, a living area that doubled as a space for homework, cartoons, and the occasional pile of unfolded laundry. Everything had its place. That was the only way life stayed manageable. Lily climbed out of bed. Can we have pancakes? Daniel considered that. We can have toast. She thought about it seriously. With peanut butter? Yes. Okay. Compromise accepted. Daniel moved to the kitchen while Lily brushed her teeth in the bathroom. He could hear her humming softly between the sounds of the faucet turning on and off. Bread into the toaster, coffee into the small machine. He opened the refrigerator and checked the milk. Enough for today. The routine moved forward quietly. When Lily came back into the kitchen, she was wearing socks that didn't match. One pink, one blue. Daniel noticed. He didn't say anything. She climbed into the chair at the small table. "Did the lady feel better?" she asked suddenly. Daniel spread peanut butter across the toast. "Yes. You fixed it fast. She was lucky." Lily swung her legs under the chair. "I told Mia at school you can fix things." Daniel placed the toast in front of her. "I can fix some things." She bit into the toast immediately, like choking. Daniel sat down with his coffee. "That one isn't magic, but you knew how." He shrugged slightly. "I learned." Lily nodded slowly. That answer made sense to her. Children often accepted simple explanations where adults wanted larger stories. She finished the toast quickly and reached for the milk. "Do we have to go to work today?" she asked. Daniel smiled faintly. "You have school. That's not the same. It kind of is." She thought about that while drinking. Daniel glanced at the clock. 6:40. They had time. Outside the apartment window, the street had begun to fill with early commuters. Engines starting. Doors closing. A bus passing at the corner. Another day assembling itself. Daniel finished his coffee and stood. "Shoes." Lily slid off the chair. "Okay." She moved toward the hallway, dragging the backpack behind her. Daniel rinsed the cup in the sink. The backpack looked heavier than it should for someone that small. Inside were books, colored pencils, a lunch container, and a folded drawing she had insisted on bringing to show her teacher. The drawing sat slightly crooked in the front pocket. Daniel noticed the edges but didn't adjust it. Some things needed to remain exactly the way children placed them. A few minutes later, they stepped outside. The morning air carried that cold edge that arrived before the sun fully warmed the city. Daniel locked the apartment door. Lily waited beside him. "Can we get hot chocolate later?" she asked. "Maybe." That means yes. That means maybe. She accepted the uncertainty. They walked toward the car together. It wasn't new. It started reliably. That mattered more. Lily climbed into the back seat and buckled herself in. Daniel checked it anyway before closing the door. The engine started with a low rumble. Traffic had begun thickening along the main road. Daniel pulled into the flow. For a while, neither of them spoke. Lily watched the buildings pass outside her window. Daniel focused on the road. His mind had already moved toward the day ahead. Work would begin at 8. Deliveries to sort. 2 drivers had called in sick the day before. That meant longer hours until the week balanced again. Nothing unusual, just the steady weight of keeping things moving. They stopped at a red light. Lily leaned forward slightly between the seats. "Daddy?" "Yes? Are you famous now?" Daniel blinked once. "No." But everyone saw. Not everyone. The people in the restaurant. Daniel glanced in the mirror. They were busy eating. Lily considered that. Then she leaned back again. "Okay." The light turned green. The car moved forward. For Daniel, the night at the restaurant had already begun fading into the background of ordinary life. A moment. A problem. A solution. Then the next day, he didn't know that somewhere across the city, a woman with far more resources than time had begun asking questions about him. And he certainly didn't expect that those questions would eventually reach the small, quiet life he had built around a 6-year-old girl and a routine that left very little space for surprises. The school drop-off line moved slowly. Cars edged forward one at a time while children stepped out with backpacks nearly as large as they were. Parents leaned across seats offering last-minute reminders that would probably be forgotten before the first bell. Daniel pulled the car to the curb. Lily had already unbuckled. She turned toward him before opening the door. "Don't forget hot chocolate." "I won't forget the maybe." She narrowed her eyes at him. "That means yes." Daniel smiled faintly. "Go on. You're going to be late." She swung the backpack over one shoulder, then paused. Children often remembered things right before leaving. "Daddy?" "Yes?" "Did the lady go home?" Daniel thought for a moment. "I hope so." "Okay." That seemed to settle the last question. She opened the door, jumped down from the car, and joined the small stream of students moving toward the entrance. Halfway to the building, she turned and waved. Daniel raised his hand. Then she disappeared inside with the others. The line of cars behind him nudged forward impatiently. He drove away. Work sat across town in a low brick building near the edge of an industrial block where delivery trucks came and went all day. The place smelled like cardboard and engine oil, the two scents mixing in a way that never fully left the air. Daniel parked near the back. Inside, the morning had already started, boxes stacked along metal racks, two drivers loading vans, a radio somewhere playing music that kept fading in and out as trucks moved through the lot. Carlos, the shift supervisor, spotted him from across the floor. "You're late." Daniel checked his watch. 3 minutes. Carlos shrugged. "That's late." Daniel hung his jacket on the hook near the lockers. "Morning." Carlos walked over holding a clipboard. "We're short again today." "I heard. South Route and River Route both need coverage." Daniel nodded. "I'll take River." Carlos scratched something on the paper. "You always take River." "It's the longer one." "Exactly." Daniel didn't explain further. Longer routes meant later hours, but they also paid a little more. Every extra hour mattered when you had a child growing faster than your savings account. Carlos leaned against the rack. "You look tired. Didn't sleep much." "Kid?" Daniel shook his head. "Dinner." Carlos frowned. "Bad food?" "Someone choked." Carlos stared for a second. "You serious?" Daniel picked up a small handheld scanner and checked the delivery list. "She's okay." "That's it?" Daniel looked up. "What else?" Carlos waited, expecting more. "There wasn't any." "You saved someone's life and that's the whole story?" Carlos asked. Daniel shrugged slightly. "She couldn't breathe." Carlos shook his head slowly. "You're strange, man." "Probably." Carlos walked back toward the loading area, still muttering to himself. Daniel didn't follow. He moved through the stacks of packages instead, scanning labels, organizing the crates that would go into his van. The work required attention, but not conversation. That suited him. By 8:20, the van was loaded. Daniel climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine. The river route stretched across older parts of the city where streets narrowed and buildings leaned slightly toward each other like they had grown tired over the decades. The first stop arrived 15 minutes later. A small repair shop. The owner signed the digital pad without looking up from the engine he was working on. "Thanks," he said. Daniel nodded once and returned to the van. Stop after stop followed. Office buildings, corner stores, a dental clinic where the receptionist greeted him every Tuesday like they were distant relatives. The rhythm of delivery work had its own quiet pace. Drive, park, carry the box, get the signature, move again. Around noon, Daniel stopped near a small park beside the river and turned off the engine. Lunch sat in a paper bag on the passenger seat. He ate slowly while watching people pass along the sidewalk. A man walking a dog, two teenagers arguing over headphones, someone pushing a stroller while talking on the phone. Ordinary movement, ordinary lives. Daniel preferred that kind of quiet. He had spent enough years earlier in life around noise and pressure that ordinary days now felt like something earned. He finished the sandwich and folded the empty wrapper. Then his phone buzzed in the cup holder. A message from the school. He opened it quickly. Reminder? Parent-teacher meeting next Thursday. Daniel exhaled slowly. He had forgotten about that. Not because it wasn't important, because there were too many small things to keep track of. He typed a quick reply confirming attendance. Then he started the van again. The afternoon deliveries took him farther along the river road. Clouds had begun forming overhead, thick and gray. Rain would probably arrive before evening. At a red light, Daniel glanced at the rearview mirror. For a moment, the memory from the restaurant returned. The woman standing there, unable to breathe. The sudden silence around her. Then the relief when air came back. He pushed the memory away again. Moments like that had happened before in different places over the years. You helped. Then you moved on. That was the rule Daniel lived by. Not because he didn't care. Because carrying every moment would make life impossible. The light turned green. The van rolled forward. Across the city, though, The woman from the restaurant had not moved on. Victoria sat in a conference room surrounded by reports and contracts, but her attention kept drifting back to the quiet man who had left without waiting for anything in return. And by the time Daniel finished his last delivery that evening, her team had finally found something. Not much. Just a partial license plate captured by a parking camera. But sometimes, a single small detail was enough to begin opening doors that people like Daniel never expected anyone to knock on. The rain started just before Daniel finished his shift. Not heavy at first. Just a slow tapping against the windshield while the van idled at the last stop of the day. The kind of rain that made the streets darker but didn't rush anyone inside. Daniel signed off the final delivery and leaned back in the seat for a moment. His shoulders ached, not sharply. Just the dull fatigue that came after hours of lifting and driving. The radio murmured quietly beside him. Someone talking about traffic downtown. He turned it off. Silence felt better. Across the river, the city lights had begun turning on, one building at a time. Reflections stretched across the wet pavement. Daniel started the engine again. Yet one more stop before heading home. School. The parking lot held only a handful of cars now. Most parents had already collected their children. After-school programs filled the last hours for the rest. Lily stood near the entrance under the small overhang, swinging her backpack in slow circles while she waited. When she saw the van, she stopped immediately. Her face lit up the way it always did when she spotted him, as if the whole day had just become easier. Daniel parked. She climbed in quickly, shaking rain off her sleeves. "You're late," she said. 5 minutes. "That's late." Daniel glanced at her in the mirror. "You've been talking to Carlos." "I don't know who that is." She buckled her seatbelt. "Did you bring hot chocolate?" Daniel reached behind the seat and pulled out a small paper cup. Her eyes widened. "You said maybe." "I changed my mind." She accepted the cup carefully with both hands like it contained something fragile. "Best dad ever," she announced. Daniel pulled the van out of the parking lot. The rain thickened slightly as they drove. Lily sipped the hot chocolate slowly. "Did you fix anything today?" she asked. "Some deliveries. That's not fixing. Depends who's waiting for the box." She thought about that. Did anyone choke? No. That's good. The city moved past them in soft reflections of red and yellow light. Daniel drove the familiar route toward their neighborhood. Everything about the evening felt normal. The quiet weight of a long day. A child talking about small things. Rain tapping against the glass. He didn't notice the dark sedan that had been parked across the street from the school. He didn't notice when it pulled into traffic 2 cars behind them. Inside that sedan, Martin watched the van carefully. He spoke into his phone. "Yes," he said quietly. "That's him." Across the city, Victoria listened. "You're certain?" she asked. The license plate matched the footage from the restaurant parking lot. Victoria remained silent for a moment. "What do we know?" "Name, Daniel Carter. 37, works for Riverline Logistics." Martin paused while checking the tablet in his lap. "Single father, 1 daughter, Lily Carter, 6 years old." Victoria felt something tighten in her chest at the confirmation. Dress? Small apartment complex on West Halper Street. Anything else? Not much. No social media presence worth mentioning. No criminal record. Military training about 15 years ago. Victoria leaned forward slightly. Military. Brief service. Medical discharge after an injury. Nothing dramatic. The sedan continued following the van through traffic. Victoria stared at the city lights outside her office window. The man she had been searching for had been living an ordinary life only a few miles away. Deliveries. School pickups. Quiet dinners, while she spent her days managing corporations that spanned multiple countries. The contrast felt almost surreal. "Martin," she said. "Yes?" "Don't approach him." "Not yet?" "Not yet." The sedan slowed as Daniel turned onto a narrower street. Martin watched the van pull into a modest apartment parking lot. "That's his building," Martin said. Victoria didn't answer immediately. Through the window, she could see the last glow of sunset fading behind the skyline. "Go home," she said finally. "Understood." The call ended. Back in the parking lot, Daniel shut off the van. Lily hopped down and waited beside him while he locked the doors. The rain had softened again. "Can I show him my drawing?" she asked. "Of course." They climbed the short staircase to their apartment. Inside, Lily spread the drawing across the small kitchen table. Crayons filled the page with bright shapes. Daniel leaned closer. "What is it?" "That's you," she said, pointing to a tall figure near the center. "And that's me." Two smaller shapes stood beside it. Then she pointed to another figure drawn in blue near the edge of the paper. "That's the lady you saved." Daniel studied the drawing quietly. "You remembered that. She needed help." Daniel nodded. "Yes." Lily looked up at him. "You always help people." Daniel didn't answer right away, because outside the small apartment building, somewhere beyond quiet streets and rain-covered sidewalks, a woman with enormous influence had just learned his name, and for the first time since the night at the restaurant, Daniel Carter had unknowingly become someone's focus. Victoria didn't sleep well that night. Not because of stress. Stress was normal. Meetings, negotiations, pressure from investors, those things had been part of her life for years. They usually faded once the lights went out. But the information Martin had sent stayed with her. A name. Daniel Carter. A job. A child. A small apartment on a quiet street. Nothing extraordinary about any of it. That was the part she kept returning to. The man who had stepped into that moment at the restaurant, calm, certain, almost automatic, was not someone who lived in the world she spent her days in. He wasn't a doctor, not a security professional, not someone whose job required emergency training every day. He delivered packages, then picked up his daughter from school. Victoria lay awake staring at the ceiling for a long time before finally turning on the bedside lamp. Her phone sat on the table beside the bed. She opened the message Martin had sent earlier, a photograph, taken from a distance across the parking lot. Daniel standing beside the delivery van while Lily climbed inside. The image wasn't clear enough to show details of his face, but she recognized the posture immediately, the same quiet steadiness she had felt behind her that night. Victoria set the phone down again. She tried to imagine the moment from his side, a father eating dinner with his child. A stranger at another table, suddenly unable to breathe. The decision to move, no hesitation, no calculation, just action. Then, leaving, she had spent her life studying how people made decisions under pressure. In business, hesitation could cost millions. But this had been different. This had been instinct. And instinct came from somewhere deeper than training. Victoria turned off the lamp again. Sleep eventually arrived in uneven pieces. Morning brought the usual movement of the city. Traffic thickened. Offices filled. Phones began ringing before the first cup of coffee cooled. Victoria arrived at headquarters just after 8. The building rose 23 floors above the financial district, its glass exterior reflecting the pale morning sky. Inside, the lobby hummed with the quiet efficiency of people who knew their roles well. Security greeted her with the same professional nod they gave every morning. Elevator doors opened. Floor 22. Her office waited at the end of a long hallway lined with glass conference rooms where assistants were already preparing for the day's meetings. Victoria placed her coat on the chair. Her assistant, Elena, stepped inside a moment later, holding a tablet. "Good morning." "Morning." Elena glanced through the schedule. Board meeting moved to 9:30. The Singapore call confirmed for 11. Legal wants 10 minutes before lunch to review the contract revision. Victoria listened, nodding occasionally. The routine flowed exactly the way it always did. Except her attention kept drifting. Finally, Elena paused. "There's something else," she said. Victoria looked up. "Yes?" Elena from Corporate Communications asked if you were planning to attend the charity event next month. Victoria almost answered automatically. Those events were predictable. Speeches, photos, large checks presented to organizations that looked good in annual reports. But the thought stopped halfway to her lips. "Send me the details," she said instead. Elena nodded and made a note. "Anything else?" Victoria hesitated. Then she asked the question she had been turning over since the previous night. "Elena, how often do we support programs for working parents?" Elena blinked slightly. "Working parents?" "Yes." Elena scrolled quickly through the tablet. "There are several employee assistance programs, child care stipends, Family leave benefits. That's internal, Victoria said. I mean, outside the company. Elena looked up. I'm not sure. I'd have to check. Victoria nodded slowly. Do that. Elena left the room. Victoria walked to the window. From this height, the city looked controlled again. Organized. Predictable. But somewhere in those streets, a man was driving a delivery van between office buildings, carrying packages from place to place while raising a 6-year-old girl. And when someone had needed help, he hadn't waited for permission. Victoria folded her arms. Power had always meant something specific to her. Influence. Resources. The ability to change outcomes through decisions others couldn't make. But Daniel Carter had changed the outcome of that night in the restaurant without any of those things. Just presence. Just action. Her phone buzzed again. A message from Martin. Should we arrange a meeting? Victoria stared at the words. A meeting. Formal. Scheduled. Structured the way every other important conversation in her life happened. She imagined Daniel sitting across a polished conference table, while someone explained why the CEO of a multinational company wanted to thank him. The image felt wrong immediately. Too formal. Too distant. She typed a reply. No. A moment later, another message appeared. Then how? Victoria looked out at the city again. At the small streets hidden between the towers. At the places where ordinary lives unfolded far from boardrooms and cameras. She typed again. I'll go myself. 3 dots appeared as Martin started typing, then stopped, then finally replied. Understood. Victoria placed the phone down. The decision felt simple, not strategic, not calculated, just necessary, because sometimes the only way to understand something important was to step outside the world that normally protected you from it. And somewhere across the city, Daniel Carter was finishing another delivery route without any idea that the woman whose life he had quietly saved was about to walk into his world for the first time. The knock came on a Saturday afternoon. Daniel almost didn't hear it. The apartment windows were open, letting in the soft noise of the street below, someone mowing a patch of grass nearby. A dog barking once or twice, the low hum of passing cars. Inside, Lily sat on the living room floor, surrounded by crayons and paper. Daniel was at the small kitchen counter repairing the loose hinge on one of the cabinet doors. The screwdriver slipped once before he tightened the last screw. The knock came again. Not loud, just careful. Daniel wiped his hands on a towel and walked toward the door. He expected a neighbor, or someone looking for the apartment upstairs. When he opened it, the woman standing in the hallway was the last person he expected to see. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Victoria stood there without the sharp edges of the business world around her. No office, no assistants, no conference table, just a hallway with worn carpet and the quiet man looking back at her. Daniel recognized her immediately. You're breathing, he said. It wasn't meant as humor, just a simple observation. Victoria nodded. Yes. The silence that followed carried the weight of the moment they were both remembering. Then Daniel stepped slightly to the side. You should come in. Victoria hesitated only briefly before entering. The apartment smelled faintly of peanut butter and pencil shavings. Lily looked up from the floor when she heard the door close. Her eyes widened. It's the lady. Victoria smiled gently. Yes, it's me. Lily scrambled to her feet and ran over. You didn't choke again, right? Victoria crouched slightly so they were at eye level. No, I've been careful. That's good, Lily said with serious approval. Daniel watched the exchange quietly. Victoria stood again. I hope this isn't an intrusion. Daniel shook his head. It's all right. She glanced around the apartment, small, neat. Every item in its place. The drawing Lily had made earlier in the week still sat on the kitchen table. Victoria recognized it instantly. 3 figures, one drawn slightly taller than the others. That's you, Lily said, pointing proudly. Victoria leaned closer. I see. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck slightly. She likes to draw. Lily crossed her arms. I'm good at it. You are, Victoria agreed. Daniel gestured toward the small table. Would you like some tea? Victoria nodded. That would be nice. He moved into the kitchen while Lily continued explaining the drawing. Victoria listened carefully. Children rarely filtered their thoughts, and something about that honesty felt grounding. She saved you, Lily said suddenly. Victoria looked up. No, she said softly. Your father did. Lily considered that. Then she looked toward the kitchen where Daniel was filling the kettle. He fixes things. Victoria followed her gaze. Daniel moved through the small space with quiet efficiency. Nothing dramatic, nothing rushed. Just the practiced rhythm of someone used to doing everything himself. When he returned with the tea, they sat around the small table. Victoria wrapped her hands around the warm cup. I'm sorry it took me time to find you, she said. Daniel looked slightly confused. You didn't have to. I wanted to. He didn't respond. Victoria studied his face for a moment. You walked away that night, she continued. Daniel nodded. Dinner wasn't finished. Victoria almost laughed, not because it was funny, because it was exactly the kind of answer she had expected by now. You saved my life, she said quietly. Daniel shook his head. You couldn't breathe. Anyone would have helped. Victoria held his gaze. That isn't true. The room grew still. Lily looked between them but didn't interrupt. Victoria leaned forward slightly. I've spent my life around powerful people, she said. People who move quickly when money or influence is involved. But when something real happens, something human. She paused. Many of them freeze. Daniel didn't look uncomfortable, just thoughtful. You didn't, she finished. He took a sip of tea. I've seen choking before. Victoria waited. He didn't elaborate. Lily spoke instead. He was a medic. Daniel looked at her. Briefly. Victoria's eyes shifted slightly. That explains some things. Daniel shrugged. Training stays with you. For a moment, the conversation drifted into quiet again. Then Victoria placed her cup down carefully. There's something I want to tell you, she said. Daniel waited. Victoria looked around the small apartment once more. At the drawings. At the backpack leaning against the wall. At the life that existed here, far from the towers where she spent her days. That night, she said slowly, I realized something. Daniel didn't interrupt. I built companies that influence thousands of people, maybe more. She folded her hands together. But influence doesn't mean understanding. Lily had begun drawing again on the new sheet of paper. Her crayons moved quietly across the page while the adults spoke. Victoria continued, You helped me breathe again. That's something I'll never forget. Daniel shifted slightly in his chair. You don't need to carry it that heavily. Victoria looked at him. I do. The words stayed simple, not dramatic, just true. She reached into her bag and removed a small folder. Daniel watched as she placed it on the table. I'm starting something new, she said. He glanced at the folder but didn't open it. What kind of something? Victoria smiled faintly. Something that should have existed a long time ago. She slid the folder toward him. Daniel opened it slowly. Inside were documents, plans, funding proposals, community programs, scholarships, emergency training initiatives, support for working parents who couldn't afford childcare. Daniel looked up. Victoria met his eyes. You reminded me what real help looks like, she said. Quiet, immediate, human. She tapped the folder gently. I want to build systems that help people before things reach the point where someone is choking in a crowded room and no one knows what to do. Daniel studied the pages again. This is a lot. Yes, you don't need me for it. Victoria shook her head. I'm not asking you to run it. Then what? She smiled slightly. I want you to keep doing exactly what you're doing. Daniel frowned slightly. That doesn't make sense. It does to me. Victoria leaned back. People trust systems when they believe those systems come from somewhere honest. She gestured toward Lily. You live that honesty every day. Daniel closed the folder slowly. The room felt quieter now, more thoughtful. Lily held up her new drawing. This one is all of us, she said. 3 figures again. standing side by side. Victoria looked at the drawing, then at Daniel. Sometimes, she said softly, one quiet moment can change the direction of a life. Daniel didn't argue with that, because the truth was, it already had. The rain returned later that evening. Soft at first, Daniel stood at the sink rinsing the last dishes from dinner while Lily sat at the table finishing another drawing. Victoria had left about an hour earlier, but the quiet she brought with her still seemed to linger in the apartment. Not uncomfortable, just different. Daniel set the plate on the rack to dry and leaned his hands against the counter for a moment. The folder still rested on the table where he had closed it. He hadn't moved it. Lily colored slowly, her small hand moving back and forth with careful attention. "What are you making now?" Daniel asked. "A school." Daniel glanced over his shoulder. "A school?" "Yeah." She held up the paper halfway so he could see. The building was crooked and bright with too many windows. Stick figures stood around it, some big, some small. One of them held what looked like a box. "What's the box?" he asked. "Stuff people need." Daniel dried his hands and walked over. "Where did you get that idea?" Lily shrugged. "The lady said helping people is important." Daniel sat down across from her. "She's right." Lily added another window to the drawing. "Are you going to help her?" Daniel didn't answer right away. He opened the folder again. Inside were outlines for programs that stretched far beyond anything he had imagined when Victoria first placed the papers on the table. Community emergency training classes, food support partnerships, scholarships for children of single parents, medical response education for public schools. Some of the pages had already been signed. Large numbers filled the funding columns. More money than Daniel had ever personally seen connected to a single idea. He turned one of the pages slowly. "Daddy?" Lily said. "Yes? You look like you're thinking." "I am." "Thinking good or thinking bad?" Daniel almost smiled. "Thinking complicated." She nodded like that was a reasonable category. Daniel closed the folder again. For most of his life, he had avoided attention the same way someone might avoid walking into traffic. Not because he feared it, because attention had a way of changing things. And Daniel had built his life carefully around stability for Lily. Work, school, dinner, sleep, repeat. Small circles that kept everything steady. The idea that his name might become connected to something larger felt uncomfortable. But Victoria hadn't asked him to become something else. She had been clear. "Keep doing exactly what you're doing." Daniel looked at Lily again. She had drawn herself standing beside the school in the picture, holding a tiny red crayon figure that looked like a child. "Who's that?" he asked. "That's someone who needs help." "And you're helping them?" "Yes." Daniel leaned back slightly. Lily continued coloring without noticing the weight of the conversation. For her, the idea was simple. Someone needs help. You help them. That was the entire system. No speeches, no strategies, just action. Daniel rested his elbow on the table and looked at the folder one more time. He thought about the restaurant. The moment the room had paused. The woman standing there, unable to breathe. And how the decision to move had come without effort. Instinct, training, responsibility, maybe all three. But mostly, just the belief that you don't watch someone struggle when you can step forward. Daniel exhaled slowly. "All right," he said quietly. Lily looked up. "All right, what?" "I'll help her." Her face brightened immediately. "I knew it." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "You knew? You always help people." Daniel reached over and tapped the paper gently. "You're starting to sound very certain about that." She grinned. "I'm right." The rain outside strengthened slightly, tapping against the windows in a steady rhythm. Daniel gathered the papers in the folder and placed it beside the refrigerator. Not hidden, just waiting. Across the city, Victoria stood in her office again. The building had mostly emptied for the night. Lights glowed in only a few scattered offices along the long hallway. Martin stood across from her holding another set of documents. "You sure about this?" he asked. Victoria nodded. "Yes. It's a large commitment. It's a necessary one." Martin glanced at the first page again. The name at the top of the program read simply, The Carter Initiative. He looked up. You didn't tell him. Victoria shook her head. He doesn't need to know yet. Why name it after him then? Victoria turned toward the window. Rain streaked across the glass, blurring the city lights below. Because some people change things without trying to. Martin considered that. You think this will change him? Victoria watched the quiet streets far below. No, she said softly. I think it will change a lot of other people. The office fell silent again. Somewhere in the city, a father was helping his daughter clean crayons off the table before bedtime. Tomorrow he would wake early, drive a delivery van, pick her up from school. Life would continue exactly the way it had the day before. But quietly, almost invisibly, the ripple from one moment in a small restaurant had already begun spreading outward. To classrooms, to neighborhoods, through people who would never know the story behind it. And Daniel Carter would probably never think of himself as the reason, because for him, it had only ever been a simple choice made in a quiet second. Someone couldn't breathe, so he helped. Then he went back to dinner with his daughter.